Hello, everybody. I've been, in the last 5 minutes, volunteered to be the moderator of this panel. So excuse me if I'm referring to notes and being slightly disorganized as we go through. My name's Marion Oswald. I'm a lawyer and an academic, and I also chair the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioners Data Ethics Panel, which maybe I can talk about a bit later. I'm going to ask our panellists if they wouldn't mind introducing themselves briefly.
Hi everyone, I'm Indra. I'm a doctor in emergency medicine and I currently work for an organisation called NHSX. So cool, you can come and see us. We're on stand 7 in the expo. But I've been leading on the AI strategy that we've been doing nationally.
Hi, I'm Delilah Hague. I'm part of Teens in AI, and we do things like organise hackathons to get more kids and teenagers interested in artificial intelligence and computer science.
Hi, I'm Lucy Wilkinson. I was part of the research, the citizens' jury last year about working out whether or not automated decision systems should be used and under what conditions.
Thanks. So what we're going to do in our panel is I will talk briefly about the RSA's citizens' jury process, and I'm using some notes that have been given to me. So again, excuse me if I'm looking at those as we go through. Then we are going to have a series of discussions with each of our panel members. We're going to think about the recommendations that have come out of that process and get everyone's thoughts on those, and potentially how this whole citizens' jury process could feed into AI deliberations going forward. So in terms of what this panel is all about, in the course of 2018, the RSA held a dialogue as a means of exploring the ethics of AI with representatives from a very wide range of society. So the process convened citizens and experts, stakeholders, so those people with knowledge of different types of applications in different contexts, and the aim was to reflect and come to conclusions on public policy issues relating to AI. And specifically, and Lucy was part of this, the RSA hosted a citizens' jury and asked participants to give their verdict in response to various questions posed by the research team. So you're a little like a proper court of law in giving your verdict on these different applications. So there were between 25 and 29 citizens involved in this process, drawn from across England and Wales, various ages, abilities, ethnicities, socio-economic backgrounds. And I don't know, were you the youngest or one of the youngest?
Yeah, I was the youngest.
You were the youngest. Okay, great. And also that in terms of recruitment, there was an aim to get a split between participants in terms of their attitudes towards technology, positive, negative, neutral, etc. And the questions they were asked include under what conditions, if any, is it appropriate to use automated decision systems? So the jury members were asked to focus on areas such as healthcare, recruitment. We've seen examples of these types of automated recruitment systems where you have to talk to some sort of AI or bot before you can get an interview, and the criminal justice system, and specifically in the area of predictive policing, so applications that aim to predict an individual's likelihood of reoffending in the future, and that's something I'm particularly interested in. So the jury came up with a list of conditions that they would like to see implemented in regards to these automated decision systems. And the recommendations relate to the design stage, the creation stage, and also the use stage, the application of these tools. And I think it's really important, actually, that that those two earlier stages were considered, design and development, and not just looking at use. So if I go through some of these conditions, I think it's interesting to reflect on how some of the recommendations that the jury members had very much reflect, I think, a lot of the discussions that have been going on within this ethics stage today and yesterday. And also, I was really struck when I read these that they reflect a lot of the legal framework that we already have around the use of these types of tools. So I think it's really interesting to see that overlap. So in terms of the design stage, it was important the jury members thought that equality and diversity was built in from the start. So that would include ensuring against bias, I should say, in training data. And this reflected a concern that ADS would be less accurate for minority groups if the data sets used for training were not sufficiently diverse. They also reflected upon this rights that relate to privacy more generally, and also reflect that the purpose limitation in data protection law, so that the data collection should not be excessive, should not exceed the requirements needed for the particular purpose that you are going to use this tool for. And they also are very concerned about the need to use anonymized data where possible. And that was particularly relevant for healthcare case studies, where the jurors saw huge potential, and we can presumably talk about that potential, but wanted to balance that with the need for anonymization and privacy. A very important area was to ensure that there was a human in the loop. Now, this, in my view, is one of the really important areas that needs to be looked at in the future, especially in relation to applications in the criminal justice system. The jurors were adamant, it says here, adamant that ADS should be used in conjunction with a trained professional. So they wanted the professionals to benefit from support from these tools, but for predictions to come with information about their potential accuracy and also their potential issues or confidence weightings, and also for the human to still retain that agency to make their own decision. And I think that's something maybe we could talk about a bit more, is actually how do you achieve that in practice when potentially the individual might be quite influenced by what they see from this tool. In terms of the creation stage, the jurors thought that it was very important that responsibilities were set down in policy and in legislation, and that there should be robust monitoring and standards set for auditing of these tools. They suggested that some sort of third-party independent body could be responsible for conducting audits to ensure accountability. And again, that's something I know that's being looked at in various sectors as to how you achieve this accountability, which independent bodies would be the most appropriate for overseeing that. Moving on to the use stage, training was seen as particularly important for the jurors. They were concerned that the potential benefits of these tools might fail effectively if they're misused, or actually if they're not used in practice. So that's equally as important, that people might misunderstand these tools or be actually suspicious of them and then actually not use them, and therefore the benefits might be not seen. In terms of the use going forward, again, in particular context, the jurors thought that it was very important that the organisation could provide a clear explanation of why a decision was reached. And this will be particularly important in some contexts like criminal justice, where the decision might be feeding into a decision that affects somebody's rights, even their liberty. And so the individual will need to have the right information in order to be able to challenge that decision. And it's noted here that the jurors did have that different expectations for explanations dependent on the sector. And again, I think that's really important and encouraging that the jurors were looking at this these contextual questions in thinking about what sort of explanation was appropriate. So that's a really sort of whistle-stop tour of the recommendations that the citizens' jury came up with. I understand that the full report from the RSA is going to be coming out pretty soon, possibly by the end of the month. So do look out for that. But I think it would be really interesting now if we actually heard from one of those jurors, Lucy, who has confessed to being the youngest juror. And now I can stop talking. And we'll pause for one moment, shall we, whilst you get mic'd up.
You got one here.
We have a mic here, actually.
Here, there's one here.
Good? I went to the wrong place.
All right, okay.
Because I got a PA rather than AI. So there we are. Shall I take over?
Please.
Thank you. Okay. There are mics there, though. Can I not really use them? Yes. I'll use those, shall I? Very good. All right. Thank you.
Put it back in the bag.
Sit back now.
Dear, oh dear. Right. Then this old bloke turned up. Hello, everybody. So we're going to be talking about AI and ethics. And the way it's going to work is that I was supposed to talk for 20 minutes. But it's actually worked out really well for you, because it means that because I'm so late, I'll only speak for 10 minutes. So everyone prefers a 10-minute speech to a 20-minute speech. So it's all working out terribly well. And then we're going to have questions. I'm going to ask the panel some questions. And then we're going to have a conversation, and we're going to involve you. And we will finish on time. And shockingly, there are actually members of my team here who've seen my humiliation. So I was hoping that nobody would ever know. But there they are. So I can't really even blame my PA, because they'll tell her. So anyway, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes about this issue of AI and ethics. The RSA did a major piece of work, and we're going to be talking about that piece of work, what came out of that piece of work. But I want to just, before I get into some of the things that came out of it, I just want to make a broader point, if I can, to start off with. Oh, you had? Yes. Oh, good. Just so you're aware. All right. How did you do that?
I've got the notes.
Oh, right, okay, so I don't even have to do my speech anymore.
Well, you could do it, and then we can see whether I got it
Shall
right.
I do the beginning and the end and not the bit in the middle? Is that the best thing to do?
We've had a good summary of what it included, the different points from the juries. Yeah.
Oh, no, but I've got some quite good things to say at the beginning and the end. Yeah, all right, I'll stick to that. You see, the reason why it's important to talk about AI and ethics, and the reason that we did this piece of work, and we are going to talk about what came out of that work. And what came out of that work, as you have heard, and we'll hear more, is quite a lot of public misgiving about automated decision systems. Okay, so we need to understand that, and I want to put that in a bit of context, and then we'll talk about what came out of it and what its implications are. So the thing I want to say, just to put this in context, is that the RSA has got a pretty profound commitment to opposing technological determinism. And there is a lot of technological determinism around, okay? So there is a lot of talk of technology will mean this. It will mean this many jobs will go. It will mean this will happen to public services. This will happen to this. This will happen to that. And we argue against that on two grounds. First of all, we argue about it because actually our record of predicting how technology is going to change society isn't terribly good. And all sorts of predictions have been made that aren't very accurate, particularly around jobs and around businesses. 10 years ago, people said the music industry was dead because of downloading and pirating. What they didn't predict was that your mobile phone would turn into a mixture of your music collection and a radio station, and that we'd go in, even in this dismal country's weather, we'd go from 10 music festivals a year to 1,000 music festivals a year. So until you know how business models are going to evolve, and there's actually deep economic reasons for this. If you automate something, then sooner or later the value comes out of it because the cost of automation falls. You have to generate new propositions. You have to generate value from somewhere else. So first of all, we're not very good at predicting this stuff. And secondly, it's just catastrophic politics to tell people that their future will be determined by technological potential rather than human need and human aspiration. And so there's a lot of the discourse at the moment about technology, which is problematic. And one of the reasons we ought to understand that it's problematic is we've been here before, because the way too many people talk about technology is the way they talked about globalization 10 years ago. It's an unstoppable force. It'll change your lives. There'll be winners and losers, but the losers need to suck it up. You don't need to understand it because these guys in banks, they're really clever, right? And that has ended very, very badly, yeah? The globalization, kind of reductive globalization discourse has ended very, very badly, as you might be witnessing. We do not want to do that again with technology. So it's really important that we bring human beings back into this conversation and we bring indeterminacy back into this conversation. So that's the kind of the framing of the work. And at the heart of that is the notion of human agency. We've got to bring human agency back into this conversation more richly than we're doing, and that's why we did this work. Now, you've heard about what came out of it, and we're going to discuss what came out of it in slightly more detail. But then I'll take all that stuff out of my speech, and I'll just end up with these points. What you'll hear is that what the public want, what citizens seem to want in relation to this technology, is they want caution, and they want proper regulation, and they want human agency. And to people who are kind of tech enthusiasts, this might seem terribly kind of old-fashioned and archaic, and why are you holding back technological progress? But I would say that the arrogance of the technology industry has not served us well thus far. You know, and that is why it is important to listen to this stuff. And sometimes technologies are pushed back, GM food being a very good example. So actually, if we don't listen to public concerns, and we don't find ways of introducing this technology in ways which are attentive to public concerns, and this is my critical point, even if those public concerns are idiosyncratic, even if they're not entirely illogical. So, you know, it may be illogical to say, I would rather be found guilty by a jury that gets it wrong 1 time in 5 than be found guilty by a robot that gets it 1 time in 100. It may be illogical, but a lot of human beings feel that way, and human beings need to be in charge. Okay? So that's why I think this work is deeply important. Now we're going to get a bit more into the detail and the nuance. Is that okay? Good, all right. I'm gradually regaining my credibility. Now, where have you got to exactly? Where have you got to exactly?
We got to the just about moving to Lucy as the jury member.
Yes. So Lucy.
Hi.
Lucy. Hello, Lucy. You were a jury member.
Yes.
Tell us about the experience of being a jury member, because I have missed all that out, and I think people will particularly want to hear that this was a very deliberative process. It's not like, you know, it wasn't like question time. You know, it was deliberative, it was thoughtful, and people with different perspectives were involved.
Yeah, so it was through an application process that you volunteered to do it, which is what Marion was saying before about they tried to get people from one end of the spectrum to the other of agreeing with AI and disagreeing with it just on a general basis. And we all like turned up and we got put into separate groups, and we had like a few different sessions, and we all got put into separate groups every time, so that you weren't just around the same people with the same voices every time. And we got given the like basic knowledge of what it was, and we voted at the beginning how intelligent we thought we were about the actual topic before we got taught about it, and everyone was relatively new to the idea of it all. And then...
So were you a bit daunted at the beginning?
Yeah, it was scary. I was a bit naive. I kind of thought everyone was going to be a student, because I was a student, and I was like, oh, yeah, getting the students. Didn't really think about what it actually was. Turned up, and I was the youngest, and I was just a bit like, whoa, Like, this makes more sense. Of course they're going to get people from all walks of life over the country. It makes much more sense. But it was a bit scary. But then everyone was, like, very open-minded, because I feel the people who, because it was like a voluntary process, like you chose to apply for it. Everyone who got picked for it wanted to be there and wanted to learn more. It wasn't like the opinions they already had was what they wanted to, like, remain with. They wanted to learn more about it. And then throughout the sessions, we got, like, talked to by different sets of experts about different aspects of how automated decision systems would be used. So we got talked to about healthcare experts, criminal justice system experts, and recruitment and, like, hiring. And we all had different discussions with each other about what pros and cons of using automated decision systems there are in these different aspects.
So, and I have to work really hard now not to get sidetracked, because one of my obsessions is deliberative democracy, and this was an example of deliberative democracy, although it wasn't democracy because you weren't making decisions, you were making recommendations. But one of the things about deliberation as a process, as distinct from conventional politics, is that people do change their minds in the process. So I'm really interested in how your thinking developed. And can you pinpoint any particular moments when you heard something that made you think differently?
Yeah, well, a lot of it was where you thought you were really behind a con, like, because it's so easy to see the cons, because everyone's like Terminator and, like, all that, and it's Skynet and all that. It's going to just go terribly. That's all we're really taught. We're never really taught anything, like, good about it, or you don't hear a lot more about it. So a lot of the cons came out quicker than the pros of the conditions of using automated decision systems. And as soon as you say predictability, like, if you're predicted, you're going to, especially in the criminal justice system where this happened, where there was a program or an idea where you'd predict if an offender would reoffend. And straight away people are like, you can't be predicted by a robot. Like, you don't even know what you might do in the future, never mind something else knowing. But then if you think about on the other aspect of trying to, like, reduce criminal rates in, like, England and things like that, and making it, like, you get less violence, less crimes, if you can do that, but it's always an if. So people were kind of hung up on the fact that it wasn't guaranteed. And I think that is a big thing you've got to think about, but especially in healthcare, where human error can be the difference between saving life or not. It was much more a pro, because if you can guarantee that this machine can do it better than a person, which it could do if there's no emotion and no, like, fear involved in, let's say like a surgery, then it would be easier to say you could let the automated decision system do that rather than the person. But it was just back and forth, like, quite a lot, but people would be more accepting of the pros after you talked about it.
And did it, just to finish with you, we'll come back later, but did it change the way, did it make you feel that you'd like to be involved in kind of processes like that again? And did it change your view of how ordinary citizens without much expertise can actually engage in quite a kind of difficult, complex issue?
Yeah, I think it's good, because you're giving a voice to everyone. You're not just letting the people who know what they're talking about dictate what's going on in the whole of the country. Like, it's not just lived in by these people who know what is going on. It's lived in by everyone. And with everyone having a voice, and everyone, or someone say something on their behalf because they're from that way of life, and you're looking at other people who aren't from the same way of life as you, but they are in the same country, it's much better, and it's a much fairer way of doing it, I think.
Great. Well, thank you for doing it and for sharing that, and we'll come back later. Delilah, you've all been introduced, haven't you?
Yeah, we have.
Very good. What do you think of the process that Lucy has just described? I mean, what do you think that process, the way in which we brought together a kind of diverse group of people, is the right way to be addressing these kinds of issues?
I definitely think, especially as these algorithms will affect everyone, everyone should have an input into how they're designed and how they're made. For example, we have countless examples of narrow data sets going to algorithms and producing horrible results. So I think the more diverse a range of people we can get consulting about these algorithms, talking to them, talking about their fears, about what might happen, what they definitely want to go into it, biases that should be avoided. I think the better the algorithms will come out and the less discrimination can be avoided.
And you're particularly as a young person working with young people, do you think there's a big age difference in relation to people's attitudes to technology? I mean, it sounds like Lucy started off certainly within her group as the youngest person being the most enthusiastic, surrounded by people going, oh, it's all doom and gloom, and then they work together to get more of a consensus. Is that typical?
I definitely agree it's typical. I know a lot of older people, if you say the word AI, either they don't know what it stands for, or they'll say something like, oh, the Terminator. But I think a lot of young people, especially as they've grown up with technology, know that it's not the scary robot coming to kill you. It's the Amazon recommendation algorithm. It's Netflix. It's something, for most of them, I think they think it's mostly beneficial. They don't really think about the kind of the bads that could happen. They think about, this makes my life easier. It takes stress away from me. It saves me time. And I think this generation is a lot more open to the good that AI can do instead of kind of thinking about the bads that could happen.
But what are the main concerns that young people have? Because this is also, young people are very concerned around issues to do with equalities, for example, and as Lucy said, there are concerns there. So if you were talking to a group of young people, and as you do, what are the concerns that are most likely to surface?
I'd say one of the key concerns right now is probably young people don't feel like their voice is being listened to in politics, especially. They feel like that sometimes they can just be shouted out by people who think they know what's better for them, so the older generation, and perhaps algorithms could be a way to reinforce that. It could be, if you don't have a technological education, that it could be used to take advantage of you. And I also feel like a big issue that young people think about is definitely climate change. I know a lot of people from my school have gone to a lot of the climate marches, and they feel like that's a big issue that a lot of people aren't talking about enough.
I'm surprised you didn't talk about the danger of bias or prejudice built into automatic decision systems. Is that not something that young people are picking up in so much?
I feel people who are more educated about machine learning do definitely think about that as a big problem, but a lot of people that I speak to about it don't actually really think about it that far, I guess, because if you haven't experienced it directly, it doesn't come to the forefront of your mind, so that perhaps this could discriminate against me, or this could affect my family, or this could turn me down because of my income or because of my past history. But I'd say definitely if you have an experience with that, for example, maybe you have a minor criminal record, you would probably think a lot more, will this discriminate against me because of something I did in my past that was minor, but will now probably affect me for the rest of my life.
And do you get the sense, just finally before we move along, but do you get a sense that young people are much more careful maybe than my generation were or even are around what is happening with data and how information is being collected and how information that's being collected about them now might be used when they're standing to be leader of the Conservative Party in 25 years or whatever it might be? Is there a growing kind of sense of sensitivity amongst young people that as to the dangers that are involved in chucking your data around, for example?
I think especially with recent scandals such as Cambridge Analytica, people are a lot more aware of what can happen if you put the wrong data online, and the fact that if you put it online, it's there forever, and you should be especially careful. And I feel like a few years ago, maybe people were a bit more lenient because they weren't sure of what could happen. But now that these algorithms have come to the forefront, they're in the news, a lot of people are reading about it, they realize this can be used, this can be searched, this can be harvested, this can be sold on to other people, my data without my consent or my knowledge. So I think people definitely think a lot more carefully, is this something I want millions of strangers to know about me?
Great, that's really interesting, thank you. Marion, thank you for taking over the chairing responsibilities in my absence.
Happy to give it back.
Let's talk kind of more broadly around the kind of policy dimensions of this. You were an expert witness in the jury process. I'm interested in what you got out of it, because we've been talking to Lucy about what she got out of it as a participant. What did you get out of it as an expert?
I was asked to go along as part of a double act with the head of criminal justice at Durham Constabulary, and we were talking about the machine learning tool that Durham Police have implemented to assist with a decision-making process around their program called Checkpoint. And Checkpoint is a rehabilitation program that is offered to certain offenders to try and move them away from a life of crime. So that the machine learning tool fits into that process by giving the custody officer a recommendation as to whether that offender is likely to commit an offence in the next 2 years. The idea being that the rehabilitation program is most appropriate for sort of mid-range offenders, medium-risk people. That's the view of the police. So we were there to talk about that tool and how it works, and some of the issues that I'd explored with Durham Police. And so we were given a very strict timeline. We had 5 minutes, I think, or 10 minutes. So it was actually quite hard to communicate everything we wanted to in that time. But then we had an opportunity to sit with jury members, and they came round and asked us questions about the tool. And what really struck me, actually, was that although there were questions about how the tool works from a technical point of view, most of the questions were about the context. So they were around, well, how does this affect the decision that's being made about the individual, and what's this Checkpoint program all about, and how does that work? And I think that brought home to me how important everybody thought context was. And you can't just look at the tool in isolation. You have to think about how it's informing a decision, and that the jury members were actually making their own judgments about the whole program, about what they thought about the Checkpoint program as well. So I think that was really important.
So that means that the focus needs to be not just on the kind of technology, but on what the technology is trying to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Who controls the technology, where power lies, the degree to which citizens have got recourse if they feel they've been unfairly treated. So you have to understand the technology within the overall system.
Yeah, and the whole life cycle and the whole context of how it informs that decision, and how significant that decision is going to be for an individual. I mean, here it was informing whether that person got put through the normal justice route through the courts, or whether they were offered a particular intervention which could have been benefit to them. So yeah, it was an important decision, and as we've seen in the United States, some of these tools are actually informing other things like parole decisions and sentencing, which very fundamentally affect people's right to liberty. So, yeah.
So when you look at the kinds of conditions that Lucy and the other participants suggested, human in the loop, recourse for citizens if we were unfairly treated, responsible use of data, etc., etc. Yeah. But then you're also working alongside a police force which has got limited resources, enormous demands, wants to get ahead with public service modernisation, provide a great service. Do you think those two things are compatible, that we can meet the human concerns and still use this technology in the ways we need to have good public services?
I think we can, because I think a lot of these recommendations they're not about stopping technology, they're about introducing it in a responsible way and ensuring there is time to step back and think about what we're trying to do with it. Is it the best way of actually achieving the objective? Should alterations happen to the design to fit these recommendations? And again, what struck me was that most, if not all, of the recommendations really reflect the legal framework in which these tools are being deployed in the public sector. I mean, for example, the human in the loop point really relates very closely to the requirements in the law for public sector bodies to ensure that they are providing reasons for their decision, that they're not fettering their discretion by basically just saying, oh yes, the computer said this, and so I'm going to do it. But I think then the next stage is, how do you really implement that in practice? That's what we're probably not quite there
because
yet.
what it puts me in mind of is that on a more kind of prosaic level, that anyone who's, as I have been, involved on lots of occasions in technological change in organisations, have seen the failure of organisations to understand technology, the need to integrate technology with deeper thinking about how the organisation works and what you're trying to do. And that's why a huge proportion of technology change processes don't work, because the technologists don't speak to the people, you know, it's not integrated with the wider strategy of the organisation or informed by it. We have to do this very differently, don't we? You know, this can't be like generations of badly implemented technological change.
Yeah, and I think it is still rather unfortunate that even now we've got you know, government guidance coming out which doesn't take that into account, doesn't take that wider need to think about the context, think about the aims of the organisation into account, but it's very purely focused on the data science without thinking about all these types of recommendations that have come out from the jury, and the need to think about human rights context and the legal context too.
Great, thanks, Marion. That's brilliant. Indra, apart from being incredibly cold...
Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't stop shaking.
I'm really sorry.
And I made the mistake of wearing
when
a skirt.
I came in, I thought you were shaking with anger because I was so late. I was really intimidated, but fortunately, it's just the temperature. Let's start with that point that I was discussing with Marion at the end. This is involved in your work, is bringing together people who really, really understand the technology with people who really, really understand the wider system and service in which it has to be introduced. That can be a difficult conversation. What have you learned about how it is you make that conversation, how you make that conversation work?
So in health, we're quite lucky, and oh my goodness, aren't those kids loud? Oh, you are amazing. Oh, thank you. Brilliant. Look at that.
See, that is
Stop seeing my
something-
shaking legs.
That is something an AI would never do.
It's like human in the loop. That's why we need them.
That's why we need humans in the loop, humans in the tent. Thank you very much.
Exactly. Thank you. You've changed my next half an hour. Where was I? What was I talking about?
You were talking about bringing together people who understand technology,
yes,
people who understand
yes.
systems, and you were saying you were fortunate in health.
So in health, we're quite lucky. So we have something called the Health Research Authority, whose role in health is to look at uses of data for direct care in research. And we're also really lucky because we have this wonderful guardian, the National Data Guardian, whose role now is a statutory role to look at uses of data within health and care. So sort of going back to some of the points that you've made, I mean, we've got to be quite honest. In health, you might hear there's a lot happening, but in terms of deployed AI on the front line, we're not seeing that much in terms of clinical front line. Yes, there's quite a bit in operational, but automated decision, what's the systems? Support system, isn't it? We're not seeing very much. What I would say is we've always caveated it in, so we have something called Clinical Decision Support System, CDSSs, and we've always caveated. So anything you look at online right now will always say, but do go and see your healthcare professional. And you're like, okay, great, thanks for that. You haven't actually taken any work away from me. In fact, maybe put a bit more on. And one of the things that came out of our user research with the public was that they do want to actually know about, not necessarily about what we call ADSs, but about what happens to their data, just in general. So we've teamed up with Understanding Patient Data, which is a part of the Wellcome Trust. Is anybody here from the Wellcome Trust? Yes, gentleman over there. So go and chat to him later. But we've got Natalie Banner coming tomorrow to talk a bit more about that work. And they're just posing different scenarios, a bit like you had for the citizens' juries, and trying to say, look, in these situations, would you be happy for your data to be used in this way? And what we're trying to get is to have that debate with the public as well, from a healthcare perspective. Everybody's quite happy for direct care. You share what you want with me as a doctor, that's fine. But when your data is then being used for something else that you might not be affected by, how does that make you feel? So we're trying to explore that now over the next few months.
And I don't want to court controversy here, but there are quite high-profile AI systems currently out there and marketing themselves quite aggressively, and which are the subject of quite a lot of social media backlash. Is that making your life more difficult?
I mean...
Do you think it's unfair? Are we turning teething troubles into more than they are? Or?
I mean, you've got to look at it. So I'm no technical expert, but the technical experts I talk to quite often say, is it really what they're doing? Is it really AI? I think we've got the same person in mind. We won't mention their name because people get upset. But, you know, if you've just got a very basic triage decision support system, you know, it's a basic methodology. Is there anything very intelligent about that? One might question. There is some really good intelligent stuff happening, and I know the guys from Imperial were talking about it earlier. You know, when you look at what they're doing, actually you can start getting a little bit worried about it. But, as I say, we do try and have these quite robust research methodologies in health to help us overcome that. What we're also working on is with our healthcare regulators around how do we now regulate this stuff. So at the moment, you regulate at a point in time. What we've got to move to is regulation as a service, so in real time.
And in the health area, I was on the short-lived ethical board for Google DeepMind. Data is at the heart of this, and the history of use of data by the NHS it's been a difficult history. There's been some downs as well as some ups. Do you feel as though those issues are towards being resolved?
I'm going to do, like, you know, you have phrase bingo. I'm going to talk phrase bingo. So we're on a journey, for sure.
On a journey, we like that.
We've had quite a few of those, haven't we? We've learnt from our mistakes in the past. So this time around, we have different schemes like the national data opt-out. So we have automatic opt-in, you can opt out. We've worked much harder with the public to try and engage them. We've worked much harder with the workforce, because you talked about, didn't you, about how actually we engage the people who are implementing these systems to say, look, it's not just us unto you, it's you with us doing it together. So I think we're trying slightly differently. We've got a lot of cover from the top, and you'll hear some of the talks tomorrow about the sort of national perspective as well. So I think, yeah, you know, if we didn't learn from the past, you've got to make mistakes, haven't you?
And then just one last issue I wanted to ask, and then I'm going to open it up to the room. But I mean, it seems to me one of the things I'm reading. I mean, one of the things that the RSA's looked at in this area, and a brilliant report we did called, I didn't write it, so I can say it's brilliant, 4 Futures of Work, was we looked at technological indeterminacy. We looked at the fact that different technologies proceed at different paces. And often one of the weaknesses of the kind of narrative about technology is going to change everything is people don't realize that some bits shoot ahead and other bits don't shoot ahead. So at the moment, for example, data science is kind of unstoppable, but there's quite a lot of blocks around robotics. It's not moving fast forward in quite the same kind of way. I'm trying to persuade the events team at the RSA to have an annual event called 5 Years to Driverless Cars, and we could have had the first one 5 years ago, and we'll still be having them in 10 years' time, in my view. In health, it seems as though diagnostics is shooting ahead. So our capacity to tell people that they may or may not have a slightly greater chance of having a particular illness is shooting ahead. The problem is that the costs of treatment are not falling down, are not declining. So is one of the dangers here that certain elements, our capacity to tell people about their risks will grow, but our capacity to be able to help them manage those risks and deal with those risks won't?
Interesting viewpoint. I'd probably say that those are moving together. So for one thing, forget about AI. Recently, we've launched the NHS app, which is there to do quite a few things, but one of them is to provide information. So if we're telling somebody, you know, here you can book an appointment, but actually here are some things that might help you. For example, vaccines, or for example, if you've got a child with a temperature, here's some validated, correct information that we've gone through the processes. So I think, obviously, we're at a tech festival talking about AI, so we get stuck in that loop, don't we? But there's a whole bunch of stuff happening here as well that I would say.
Okay, so I'll make it more concrete then. If we were able to predict, if everyone was able to predict in their 30s their likelihood of developing Alzheimer's, but yet we didn't really have, and yet the only drug that was available was incredibly expensive and only made a 10% difference to people's chances, everybody would want it. No, the NHS could not afford to pay for it, and people would just be quite miserable and frightened, to put it harshly. And that's what I mean about what happens if certain capacities of the technology advance and others don't.
So I'll give a slightly different example. So I was at a conference in Geneva with the WHO, and this guy from India came up to me and he said, "Oh, we got this great technology. It screens diabetic retinopathy. Really great." And we deployed it in a population, and suddenly we screened loads of people with diabetes, but then we got stuck because we don't have any doctors. So what do we do? And I said, well, mate, maybe you should have thought about that before you did that.
Very good,
Duh. But I said, no, that's terrible, really terrible, ethics and all. So I think these are big problems happening already.
Yep.
We're quite fortunate in the NHS that we move quite slowly, So we're quite cautious about deploying certain things here because we have a national healthcare system and we have to look at the public versus private payers who go out and do it themselves. So whilst I agree these problems are happening already internationally, we're trying to learn from those partners to say, well, actually, it's a choice, isn't it? So I get people all the time who come to my A&E and I want a scan. I want it now. And that's why I came here. And I have to weigh up that choice and go, yes, you can have a scan, but A, we don't have enough people to do the scan for you tonight. What's the benefit of having that scan now? And also, if you had the result of that scan now versus tomorrow morning when the clinic is open, would it make a difference? So I think it goes back to having a human who can then weigh up what the diagnostics is going to tell you versus the immediate need of having that diagnostic.
Which goes back to human in the loop, which goes back to
goes back to
recognising how
having-
these systems have to work together, because it could be someone turning up at A&E saying, actually, I have scanned the rash on my daughter's arm, and there's a 14% chance that it's meningitis, therefore I demand, and so these things,
And we do
how
that
health
already,
professionals deal
yeah.
with that is going to be
Yeah.
a challenge. Great. Well, look, that was fascinating from all four of you. Thank you very much. Let's open it up now to questions, points. I'm particularly want to hear from people who are tech nerds who think this is all complete bollocks and we should just get ahead and implement the technology regardless of all these ridiculous human hang-ups. I'm challenging you. Okay. Is that what you're going to say? Try this one. Try this one. Oh. I'll do the small... it's on.
Hello. Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
tell us who you are. Tell us who you are.
So I'm not a tech nerd. My name's Charlie. I kind of came here just to sort of ethics particularly, and a lot of the points you raised. Actually, I didn't even know about the RSA doing this stuff, so that's, a different separate point. But to Marion, about the decision systems today, so how often did the case officer reject the recommendation from the software? I was kind of curious as to that. And then maybe also on the flip side, when the situation was made, how often was that challenged by the individual?
Marion. Yeah, how happy were people who were actually subject to the system?
I don't know the answer to that first question in terms of how often the custody sergeant rejects the recommendation, but Durham have done some initial research in looking at the recommendation of the system, and then what the custody officer would have predicted this person as being, and seeing how often they agree, basically. And there is a considerable difference between what the tool predicts and what the individual would predict. And that is probably to do with the fact that the tool does not have all the information that is needed to make this decision, because the human officer has to go away and also look at other bits of information in other police systems, and also think about that person that's standing in front of them, and who they are and what their circumstances are, etc.
Does it mean that sometimes people can hide behind the claimed objectivity of the system, and therefore disguise the fact that they are still human beings making judgments? I mean, we're talking about putting the human in, but of course the option is also to be able to say, well, sorry, mate, this is what the system says.
Well, I think there is, and I think this is one area that needs to be looked into more, is how actually police officers are in practice reacting to this system. Are they just actually going, okay, it says green and therefore it's green, or are they genuinely going away and considering all the other bits of information they need to, and how are they balancing, how are they weighing those things up? I think that's what we don't know yet.
Great, thank you. Yep.
Sophia Adams-Varty, Director of Policy at the Law Society, and quick plug, we published just a week ago a report Thank you very much to Marion and colleagues for contribution on that, on the impact of AI in the criminal justice system. And one of the things that we address in that is the lack of transparency of the use of these tools across criminal justice, or indeed, and you can replicate that across any public service provision. And I think for those of us that come from a deliberative policy-making background, we can see the benefits of being able to have a transparent conversation with our local communities. And the question, however, I think arises is how do you do that at scale? And I just wonder if, I wonder to what degree the panel might offer thoughts on how do we do that across local communities at a scale that is replicable, because each one of those communities needs a voice of its own, but because a national debate just gets lost in a quagmire of principles, whereas actually what we need to do is engage. And some of the examples that we've heard from the citizens' jury, I think, are really quite motivational and supportive of doing it well, but I just wonder how we might do that.
So I guess the way I kind of interpret that question is to ask, I'll start with you, Lucy, this was a kind of one-off, but is your sense that going forward we will need these kinds of forums to be built into the way that systems work, so that it is assumed that when technology develops you can go back and there are examples like the patients panel used by NICE, for example, is a group of informed patients who give advice to NICE about whether or not the NHS should pay for very expensive treatments for very rare diseases. And that's just built into their decision making. So do you think we should be building in the kind of process you were involved in, just building it into decision making?
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea because you get opinions and ideas from like different people that you wouldn't necessarily thought of yourself, because if the people who are making the decisions are all from the same, like they're in the same company or they're all wanting the same outcome, you're going to be very restricted on how far outside the box you're going to look about things that contribute to the decision in the end. Whereas when you get people who have, like, people who in layman's terms have no idea really what you're on about, they can bring to the table something you might not have initially thought, because you're like, the companies are looking at one direct path forward, whereas people of the public have no idea what path you want to go down. They're just going to tell you all the contributing factors that you probably should look into.
And Delilah, I mean, people often talk about young people's engagement in politics, and young people, even when they vote more often, like in the last general election, still vote less than older people. Do you think these kind of deliberative methods are attractive to young people as ways of having their voice heard? I mean, you know, if we ask young people to say, you've got to spend 2 days looking into an issue in depth, is that something that will attract young people as actually a more effective way of having your voice heard than voting, for example?
I feel as long as the process was clearly explained to the young people participating, I think they would definitely feel incentive to do so, because I feel politics is often really opaque to people who don't learn about it, who don't know how it works. They're not sure what to do. They feel like, I don't have a voice. What can I do to change this? And they're not completely sure. But with a deliberative process, if you talk like people like you, who look like you, who come from the same area from you, and also people who aren't like you, people who come from a different socio-economic background, have different political ideals, have had different experiences, I think it's a much more wholesome experience to create a really good outcome if you can interact with someone face to face instead of perhaps just a ballot box, or someone who you don't know who talks about politics you don't understand and you're not sure this is right for me. But if you talk with people who clearly explain what to expect, you say what you want, you say what you think is right, I think that'd be a much better way of going about politics and important decisions.
I thought you'd just come down to wave at me, but you were holding up your fingers to say 5 minutes, weren't you? I thought, what a nice thing to do. Just come down and go, hi. No, but you mean 5 minutes, don't you? Okay. I'm guessing, so because I want to get a couple more questions in, I'm guessing both of you would recognise that that in the future we are going to have to start to build these quite sophisticated, deliberative forms of decision-making accountability into the way in which public policy and public services unfold. You know, because the way we've done consultation in the past is pretty clunky.
I think in criminal justice, and certainly in policing, it's a way forward that police forces are starting to consider. I chair a committee that's been set up by the West Midlands Police and the West Midlands Police Crime Commissioner specifically to oversee the data analytics projects within that force. It's a very big force, and so it's got its own lab and some quite sort of sophisticated ideas as to tools that they are thinking about building. So that model potentially is something that could be taken forward as a framework for other forces to implement. I mean, the thing with police forces is they operate very independently, and they have different issues in different areas. But that doesn't mean to say that there couldn't be a framework that is used for these types of oversight arrangements. So yeah, I think it would be useful.
Great. Well, there's any more questions? There's one here, and any more? One there, and any more?
One over there.
Right, we'll take these three, and then the panel will all have 45 seconds to respond to the three questions. So let's hope they're not too complicated. Go.
Very simple question. Sanya Sheikh from the Futures Institute. We're talking about deliberative sort of processes, and I wondered how likely you think that is, given possibly how disconnected government is from technological advancement. Do you feel that they have the understanding? And also given Brexit, so if China and America are surging forward in the commercial sense, and Europe is the kind of regulator, and Britain's dropping out altogether and needs cash, how is that going to work?
I may excuse the panel from answering the Brexit question, but they have to answer the first half. Yeah.
Alec Robertson. There are two economies. One is market value and market goods. The other is social goods and social value. Citizens are generally expected to accept the social goods and not the market goods. So in health, for example, one could say a drug company might get 1,000 people to give their data, and they may get a drug for it and be thankful for it, but then they'll make $1 billion, but they won't share any of the $1 billion with the citizens. So is there a need for fairness and fair trade in data as a general principle, whether it's justice? And I think that's what you're talking about, but the whole fair trade thing is a crucial interest of mine.
I'm going to ask Indra to answer that one, and then, because she was nodding while he was speaking, although she might just have been shivering very violently. Yeah, and then finally, yeah.
So my name is Daniel, and I'm a student in London. My question to all of you is, once my teacher told me, if you want to be a successful engineer, you should be able to see and create lots of problems and then solve it. Without problems, there won't be any solutions. So back to Indra, the problems you had by a group of small people creating them and then not being able to solve it because you can't find doctors. How do we ensure or have a safety net for these engineers, but at the same time for the lawyers and doctors out there, as we all are today?
Wow, big questions. So, panel, you've got 35 seconds each, or else you can start waving at me again. You don't feel the need to answer all of those questions. You might want to pick out one and or leave us with a closing comment. I'm going to go in reverse order. Indra, just choose one of those points or one thing you want to say.
So I love that. Let's cause problems so we can solve them. I'll just say, so to answer a few questions, one thing we've done is we wrote a code of conduct, so a set of principles which go across everything. And that's great, it's nice to have principles, but how do we turn that into a practical workbook? So actually, I can't remember, you asked, like, how do people show that this is okay? And we talk about bias, we talk about ethics. How is the algorithm working? So we're testing that out now with a couple of companies, and we're trying to work in partnership with anybody. We're working in partnership with you, aren't you, as well?
Yeah.
I mean, we're open door. Come and chat to us. We're happy. And your question, I've been talking about this for 10 years, so should the patient as a person be in charge of their data? But then it goes beyond that, doesn't it? So if you start thinking about consumer data, insurance data, etc., it's a massive question. We should have a drink and talk about it. But
there's a book called Surveillance Capitalism I can recommend on this very topic. Yes.
On the last point, the police are continually being forced down the preventative agenda, I think, at the moment, in terms of having to think about how to prevent crimes, how to foresee crimes, how to step in that arena. So it raises the question, if your resources are diminishing, yet you have this now preventative role, how do you deal with that? And this I think is one of the reasons why these tools are attractive, because they help you prioritize your resources. But if this continues, we get into the same issue around, well, you've prioritized, then what do you do? What happens if you miss that person, or somebody who's high risk drops off the agenda? I don't think these questions have at all been looked at yet, and that relates to the other point about the potential lack of engagement of central government in this issue.
Thank you. Delilah?
I'd like to focus on your point. I think the opacity of companies really needs to be legislated against, especially as there's loads of companies that, especially genetics companies, where people send off their DNA for a test. It tells them, you're 36% Norse. But what people don't know is that their data is being sold on to other countries to gather information about them. And that data could be used against them in the future. Perhaps their genes indicate they have a high risk of Alzheimer's, so their health insurance will cost more. Or they're more likely to get cancer, so their employer won't want to keep them on as long. I think it's incredibly important that people know, especially with the important data, who's using it, what it's being used for, how long it's being kept, and if they want to, for it not to be stored anymore in that way, and for them to have complete control and know who's using my data and what they're using it for.
Brilliant, absolutely. Lucy?
I just think with that question as well, and just the questions in general, with talking about the outcome of where it's going to go, with, for example, with the citizens' jury, these questions are asked and it's talked back to in layman's terms so people understand it. And like what Delilah said there, if people know more about it and are taught more about how to handle their own data and what it actually means, because there's all of these like different terms that nobody really understands, but they're just thrown out and you're like, oh, yeah, and kind of know what it is, but don't actually really know. The more times you can get people around together to discuss things like this, there's more knowledge to everyone, so everyone has an idea of what things are actually talked about.
And the brilliance of the citizens' jury deliberative process is that most people are too busy to do what you did, but then if they know that someone like them, like you, did it, they think, well, I would, which is why we respect the juries in criminal trials, I would probably have made the same decision if I heard the same information, which is not how they feel about politicians, because whether it's fair or not, they think politicians are a completely different tribe and not like human beings at all. Well, it's been a fantastic session. Keishana, when does our report come out? This month? Okay, but it will be on the RSA, it'll be on our Twitter and all that stuff, so look out for the report. It's fantastic. Thank you to our wonderful, very, very cold panel. It's been a brilliant session, despite the cold and despite me being late. And it just remains for me to say that Marion said something which reminded me of an old joke I heard, which is that a friend of mine threw a trifle at a policeman, but then realised he was a custody sergeant. Okay, on that bombshell, can I ask you to thank the panel for their fantastic contributions?